Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Greta Werner and I'm a postdoctoral researcher with the Henry Halloran Research Trust, focusing on policy, impact and translation in urban infrastructure, including housing and transport. I would like to acknowledge that this university campus stands on the unceded country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We recognise and pay respect to Gadigal elders and communities past, present and emerging. For thousands of years they have shared and exchanged knowledges across innumerable generations for the benefit of all. Welcome to our discussion of the publicness of transport. This event is part of a program of events run by the Henry Halloran Research Trust across University Research Centre, dedicated to fostering multidisciplinary research on cities, regions and communities. The Festival of Urbanism is our flagship program of public events to promote evidence-informed dialogue between researchers, community, officials and advocates and practitioners. So before I introduce the chair, I would also like to let you know that there will be a short reception at 5:30, followed by our event on comedy and communications called The Rental Market is a Joke: How Comedy and Social Impact Documentaries Can Improve Public Debate and Policy. After which there will be another reception and the announcement of the winners of our Reels competition. So we look forward to seeing you there if you can make it as well. Now let me introduce the chair of this session, Dr. Rebecca Clements. Rebecca is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Sydney and RMIT. She recently completed a postdoctoral fellowship with the Henry Halloran Research Trust's Infrastructure Governance Incubator. She's now undertaking research on the Deep Timetable, an ARC project at RMIT, and also several projects on micromobility with the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies. Her research is concerned with planning sustainable and equitable cities with a focus on overcoming urban car dependence. Her work encompasses parking policy approaches in Australia and Japan, transport and mobility justice approaches, such as children's independent mobility, and transformative infrastructure governance. Thank you, Rebecca Clements.
Wonderful. Let's see if I can get this to work. Yep, okay. There's something. So thank you so much, Greta, and thank you everybody for joining today. And I'll also begin by acknowledging that we're here on unceded Gadigal lands today on an exceptionally beautiful day in Sydney. And also I'd like to acknowledge that I began my day very early today on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land in Naarm, Melbourne. And the context that sovereignty was never ceded is, of course, a very important concept for this festival and for this topic, because of how we conceive of publics in asking these questions. So I'm so thrilled to be chairing this session today. When I heard originally that the theme of this festival was going to be public urbanism, I was so pleased because this is such an important provocation for our cities right now, for the questions that we're asking, and how we shape and govern and collectively imagine and demand transport and mobility futures in Australian cities and regions. I knew that myself and my very wonderful colleagues, Associate Professor Crystal Legacy and Dr. Ian Woodcock, had all for years been passionately researching and engaging communities in questions about the politics and the governance and the ethics of urban transport and mobility. And they have, as always, been fantastic partners in crime putting together this provocative event today. And we do sincerely hope that this is a provocation, not a beginning and an ending of a question and a set of answers, but really helping to fan the flames of many more diverse and very passionate and political discussions on the publicness of transport and how we might reshape our futures. So, why is publicness such a vital provocation for all of us right now? And what does it even mean in the context of transport? I think a lot of people who, a lot of the people here today who have come here today would probably come to this question with several of these quite common understandings of publicness. So, you might think about forms of public ownership of assets, like public transport assets, for example. You might think about reflecting and enriching public interests in the way that we shape cities. You might think about how we shape governance and play inclusive and diverse roles in governance and planning. You might, of course, think about impacts on public space in various ways. And of course, I would expect a lot of people think about questions of equity and justice for many, many diverse kinds of publics. I think one important dimension to all of these is that sometimes, while it might be hard to clearly or definitively define publicness, in fact, I think it's quite impossible, it's an idea that often gains clarity from sensing outcomes that are not public for various reasons. So that might bring to mind for you questions of privatization, different forms of privatization, perhaps opaque decision-making, perhaps the erosion in various ways of what we see as public interests. And for example, if I were a speaker here today, I would be talking to you about the many, many ways I believe and that research shows that car-dominated cities erode publicness. From the mind-boggling amounts of space they take away from much more public uses, such as through roads and car parking, to the kinds of amazing futures that we lose through giving so much priority and resourcing and political power to making car-based cities, instead of ensuring, for example, safe and enriching neighborhoods for children and again, many other diverse members of our community. But I'm not a speaker today. I am instead very proud to now hand over to our excellent panel of speakers who will be exploring this idea in a range of ways and presenting many provocations for discussion and debates together as well. So each speaker is going to come up and give a short presentation, and then afterwards we will have hopefully quite a lot of time for not just question and answer, but also hopefully a collective discussion together on this various topic. So first up, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Ian Woodcock, who is a senior lecturer in urbanism. There we go. Who is a senior lecturer in urbanism in the Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning. Actually, I should go to this one for Ian. At the University of Sydney. He is a UK registered architect with over 30 years of experience encompassing practice, research and teaching across government, private and community sector settings. His research focuses on urban change, sense of place and the use of design as a research method. So please join me in welcoming Ian.
Thank you, Rebecca. Now let's see if I can make... Yes, it does. It works. Yes, and like Rebecca, I got up very early on Wurundjeri watering land this morning after not having very much sleep. So I hope I'm going to be able to make some sense with my 5 slides. So what am I going to talk about? When Rebecca and Crystal and I first sat down to talk about this, the first thing that came to my mind was this issue of the public being captured by private interests. That's what really interested me. And I was thinking, well, what is left to be captured, given that pretty much everything has already been captured by the private sector? Particularly if you're in Melbourne, where everything got privatised in the 90s, and it's all run by franchise companies, and everything else is getting taken over by the private sector. There's not much left that's in public hands. And I thought, well, maybe walking. And then, of course, I was musing on John Lennon's song, on the Beatles song there about the tax man. Of course, they know that if it was in the public sector, they'd tax walking. And I thought, well, this is really interesting, because what really interests me about this is the way that I don't think walking can be privatised, and I don't think walking can be taxed. But what concerns me is the way that we frame the discussion around all of the ways that transport can be organised and delivered in a way that maybe takes our attention off walking and other things that need to be done. And so this beautiful diagram is kind of something that it's a thing of beauty, and it's from an article called the case for public transport in an age of automated mobility. And although the lead author is someone called Doherty, Crystal's actually a co-author of it, and John Stone and a number of other colleagues in the transport planning space. And I think it kind of summarises, it's a different way of summarising all those issues that Rebecca introduces to in her slide, but it's you can kind of see there's a sort of hierarchy in this publicness iceberg, where the things that the policymakers tend to look at are at the top. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we like to talk about, particularly in academia, but also, we like to talk about, in terms of things that ought to be done but aren't adequately taken account of by policy. And then below that are those really hard to get your head around things that we all really actually care about or ought to care about, but somehow don't make themselves their way up through the pyramid back into policy or the sort of ways that we have of measuring what matters. And so I'm not going to focus on all of those things today. I'm only going to focus on one of them, which is this, the so-called first and last mile problem. Now put your hands up if you have heard of this before. Now I'm surprised. I would have thought everyone would put their hands up, because you hear it all the time, and it's supposed to be, everything is going to solve the first and last mile problem. It kind of slipped into transport from logistics to public transport logistics sometime around the late 90s, early noughties, middle of the noughties, I think, and became a real thing about a decade ago, particularly with the advent of our obsession with automating everything. And particularly now, of course, with the whole sharing economy idea and the whole so-called micro-mobility. It used to be bikes and scooters, and now it's micro-mobility. The problem is that the fundamental problem from a conceptual point of view is that first, the F in the equation actually is traditionally referred to people, passengers, especially children actually, whereas the L, the last mile, has traditionally referred to goods and freight. And by combining the two, the people who advocate, let's all look at the first last mile problem and use all these technologies to solve them, particularly automated ones, is because they regard it as being the same problem. Effectively, people, especially children, are the same as goods, okay? And what does that mean? You're talking about freight. Now, you think about yourself, right? You're out there in the street, you're thinking about things like this. These are all things where you want a sense of agency. You want to have a sense of choice. It's about your experience. You're not an object. You're not a parcel. Do you want your city's transport, movement, mobility planned as though you have no choice, no agency? Do you want to be dominated completely by environments like this, where you are continually surrounded by machines and increasingly high-tech stuff that governs exactly what you do, because you're being seen as this thing, this object, this parcel, this lump of stuff that needs to be freighted from somewhere else by something which, is going to take away your ability to walk, or, use your energy or smell the flowers. So the next time you hear first last mile problem, I want you to be suspicious, very suspicious about what you're being sold. Thank you, that's me.
Thank you so much, Ian. So I'll introduce our next speaker. So Emma Bacon is the founder and executive director of Sweltering Cities. Since the beginning of 2020, Sweltering Cities has connected with thousands of people around the country, working directly with communities in our hottest suburbs to campaign and advocate for more livable, equitable, and sustainable cities. Emma is a passionate organiser, campaigner, and activist. She has worked across movements for social and environmental justice for over 13 years, and has been part of winning significant outcomes for progressive change at local to international levels. Emma is committed to building a broad movement for climate justice, and she lives and works on the land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. Thank you, Emma.
Awesome. I'm going to go to a photo that doesn't make me feel so awkward. There, fantastic. So yes, you've just heard my little intro, but Sweltering Cities is a small but mighty team of really amazing people working now in Sydney and Melbourne. We've got 5 people on the team, one of whom, Sana Shah, is here. Sana, wave, where are you? Over there with also one of our old colleagues, Danny Villafania, who really, I just wanted to acknowledge from the beginning, have done the hard yards in terms of the listening and the data mapping and understanding ArcGIS, so I didn't have to do it. So, wonderful women. We started out 5 years ago talking to people about how they experience the impacts of heat, and especially starting in Western Sydney, which we know is really powerfully affected by rising temperatures, but also the intersections that make people really vulnerable. We started out having hundreds of conversations with people about how they felt the heat. And something that kept on coming up again and again, that was sort of a surprise at the beginning, how often it came up, was people saying, there are no bus shelters where I live. I cannot even leave the house on hot days because I'm walking down these treeless streets. It's a nightmare. The buses don't even turn up. And a real sense of political frustration as well, saying like the people who plan our cities and make decisions don't care about what my life is like. They don't care about my community. And this just kept on coming up again and again. So what we decided to do was actually lean into that work and say, yes, bus shelters are a small piece of infrastructure in some ways, but there are thousands of them across the city. There are thousands of them in suburbs that get up to 50 degrees on the streets. And so we wanted to look at it as a big problem, not just one at a time. This slideshow has a few photos of terrible bus shelters or bus stops. This is one of my favorites. This one is marked on Google Maps as being accessible because it has that small concrete pad, and that's what was allocated, because if you're there, then that means you've walked down a footpath and you can, it's indicating that this is where the bus stop is. This is obviously not true. This is in Minchinbury. One of the things we started to do was ask people to send us pictures or information about their local bus stops and, or bus shelters. And so we've just been, since then, over the last 3 years, we've received hundreds of photos. I'm now sort of the bus shelter person in my friendship group, so I now get sent them from around the world. There's great ones in New Zealand, and they're air-conditioned in Saudi Arabia. But we started getting lots of photos and collecting photos ourselves around Western Sydney. These are from a couple of years apart, but you can see on the left one in Casula. It's opposite a daycare centre. There's a park just behind it. And those are a series of electricity wires wrapped around at head height. And the only sign that it's a bus stop is a little metal tag on the pole. The other one's in Penrith. I mentioned before there's parts of the cities that get to 50 degrees on the ground. In Penrith, in January 4th of 2020, it was 48.9 degrees, but they measured higher temperatures on the ground. Imagine being at this bus stop because you had to be, because you had to run errands, because you had to go to work on a 48.9 degree day. Bus stops also exist within the context of our urban heat island suburbs. More and more, this is the way we're planning our suburbs. They're really unsustainable. There's lots of treeless streets. And this is what people would tell us. We're walking long distances and really hot streets, and it means it's exhausting when we get there. We heard stories from people like Andrew, who's a disability support worker, and he said that the clients he would go and see 4 or 5 clients a day, and they would say, I'm trying to follow the health advice, I'm trying to do my best, but after it's been hot for a few days, I need to go get more food, I need to run errands, and I'm doing my best, but it is so hard. I feel sick, I feel dehydrated, just waiting for the bus. There are no shelters. Another person called Jane who said, this isn't my problem. I actually drive a car. And then she said, actually a little while ago, I broke my leg, and a couple of days a week, I pick up my grandchild. But I just couldn't do it because the stops at my house, the stops at the school, the stops at her son's house, none of them had any seats or any shelter. So it meant that for the months that she was unwell, she couldn't play that function, and the entire family's, weekly arrangements had to change. I'm going to go much quicker. We did some big summer surveys asking people how they felt. The really big stat that jumped out, 2/3 of people in Penrith said they wanted more to be done. What we did then was we mapped we mapped 500 stops in Penrith at first, and then we mapped 2,500 stops across the city. We have a better map of the bus stops in Sydney than Transport for New South Wales does, because they don't have one of the entire city, just to demonstrate that this problem is specifically bad in Western Sydney, not just in the older suburbs, but also in places like Schofields, where the amount of bus shelters is as low as 30% of stops have shelter, shade, or a seat. I'm skipping because I went too fast. This is the bus stop that won our competition for the worst bus stop in Sydney. We had lots of fantastic nominees, and this one won. What locals said about this is that there are snakes in the grass. The trucks zoom by. It's really unpleasant to be there. But then when Penrith Council was asked, when Transport New South Wales were asked, they said, no one uses this stop. I was like, oh, well, what's the order in which this is going? I'm going to finish now, but I think I definitely plan to talk too much about bus shelters, which is, again, a personal problem I now face. But to say that the ask that we've identified to actually solve this problem is that the New South Wales government should take responsibility for solving this at a system scale instead of it being a local government problem, and put $20 million into installing at least 2,000 more stops across the city, primarily in our hottest suburbs, where there are schools, hospitals, aged care homes, daycare centres, places like that. And we have hundreds of residents around the city. We have lots of organisations partnering us, and the Transport Minister has said, this is not our problem. They've actually said, this is a local government problem. And we've gone back and said, that means people in Fairfield can't catch the bus. And they've said, this feels like a Fairfield problem. And I think this shows that what a crisis it is for people not to perceive this as a problem because it doesn't affect them. And that in fact, this is not a problem of technology, this is a problem of power. This is a great bus stop someone designed for us, with the idea that, we've talked to now hundreds and hundreds of people across the city about what they want their local transport and bus shelters to look like, and not one person has ever mentioned, I'd love more advertising. And not one person has ever mentioned, I'd like more metal seats that get too hot to sit on a hot day. They do mention it being really accessible and having lighting and information and things like that. I'm going to finish there because I think I've gone past my time.
Thank you so much, Emma. So our next speaker is not in the room with us, but is coming to us from Zoom, which I think we're getting up now. So David Babineau is the Secretary of the Bus and Tram Division at the New South Wales Rail, Tram and Bus Union, or the RTBU. David works closely with the President of the Bus and Tram Division, Peter Gratch, to coordinate the daily management of the activities undertaken by the division and to support bus and tram members in New South Wales. Thank you so much for joining us, David. So give him a warm welcome while he's...
How are we doing? Can I be heard?
Yes.
Splendid. So, hi everyone. I can't see who I'm talking to. I'm talking to myself on a screen. It's discombobulating, but that's all right. Look, from our perspective and from my perspective as somebody who drove buses for state transit before they were privatised, because they have all been privatised now. There are no publicly run buses in New South Wales. Publicness is very specific, and for my sins, we deal a lot with Transport for New South Wales, and what it sort of revolves around is public accountability and how that intersects with bureaucracy. The biggest issue, of course, is that the nature of bureaucracy is that it's scared to make a decision that it may have to stand behind, and that's true of anything, more so of transport, given its massive size. The main issue that we found when the buses were privatised in Sydney was that state transit, as a government operator, had effectively semi-professionalised a non-professional industry. And so, they ran 4 regions in Sydney, one in Newcastle. The 4 in Sydney effectively, and I believe this is still the case, comprise over 75% of all the trips that are done daily in Sydney. So there may have only been 4 of 15, well, 4 of 10 now, but the volume was distinctive and really set them aside in terms of operating environments. And State Transit had been doing that for many, many decades and had developed an expertise. There was a stable industrial environment. There was a stable operational environment. You had a situation where regulations weren't being changed here and there and practices weren't being changed here and there simply to pursue profit. It was service delivery. That was the priority, and everything sort of stemmed from that. What I've seen is that since privatisation, and Transport was really unaware of this until they've been running into the issues here and there, but what's happened is there's this void because Transport was completely unaware of the repository of expertise that was within state transit. The 4 regions were given to private companies, and through COVID, we saw a lot of dodgy practices. The KPIs were structured in such a way that you either met them or you didn't, which meant, of course, if you didn't meet them, then why would you bother continuing to try? And so we had trips being slashed to conserve on the overtime. We had, standard instructions for drivers that if they got to Central and they were running late, that they would put up not in service and simply drop passengers only. There were a lot of practices, and all of it stemmed from the fact that all of a sudden the travelling public were customers, whereas when I was driving, they were passengers, and we had a duty of care, and we took that seriously, often to our own detriment as drivers. But that's really the fundamental difference. And now we're in a situation where Transport has found themselves in a position where they are suddenly needing to be more than regulators, when in essence they're nothing more than that. They don't know, they don't understand the industrial instruments, they don't understand the timetables in terms of how they play out on the ground. They are either not understanding or unwilling to become involved in a great many operational issues. It was only last week where I had to reach out to the companies and try and figure out the timetable for how often they clean driver seats. And the most often was twice a year. So, imagine getting on and sitting on a dirty bus seat. Imagine doing it if it hadn't been cleaned for 6 months across summer. It's this is just the way it is. This is what we've been gifted, and it is effectively the politicization of transport. Whereas transport, like any other essential service, health, utilities, education, these things should have a base level of government provided service, because the point of the entire system is to make sure that no one's left behind, because we're only supposed to be going as slow as our most vulnerable. If somebody wants to come along and provide some magic bus that rolls out the red carpet as a private service, great, they can do that in the same way that they do with health or education, and offering a superior product for those able to pay. But public services need to be exactly that. And what we found, certainly in Sydney with buses, is that there is no interest in continuing that, once proud tradition of 90 years. We'll be campaigning next year to try and start reversing that, but it's an uphill battle. A lot of people see it as a fait accompli, and really, given that it has been politicised, it's vitally important that people actually stand up. So whether it's the Sweltering Cities initiative or anything else where you're engaging the public needs to take ownership of it, because God knows they pay for it.
Thank you so much, David. I think we'll need to switch back to the slides quickly. Great. So our next speaker is Neil Miller. He's the Director of the New South Wales Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure's Transport Advisory Team. He's an accomplished urban planner with 17 years' experience, specialising in the planning and design of place-based transport outcomes. Having worked in both consulting and government roles across the transport and planning sectors, he has developed a range of strategies to support city-shaping initiatives and transport network designs. He has led the development of multimodal transport strategies, transport and land use planning policies and plans, provided expert guidance and collaborated with stakeholders and partners across different levels of government. So thank you so much, Neil.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks to the speakers already. I think there's probably a few synergies in what I'm going to talk about. So I want to talk very briefly about the role that streets and roads play in our society and the public domain, and the way we think about them, the way we plan them, the way we evaluate the performance of streets, and how that historically that may have led to some of the outcomes that Emma talked around buses, and Ian talked about poor walking environments. So when we talk about streets, streets need to be considered from several lenses. Importantly, what role streets have in the context of place. And we understand place from different lenses. Place can be thought about through the type of and level of activity that is generated within that environment. We think about place from its physical form and how it feels. And importantly, what does a place mean to us as a community and society, and what role does the street play in facilitating those important functions? Is there somewhere for us to meet friends and family? Is there a way that I can easily get to a place? Is there shade for me to sit and enjoy a place? What are the design factors within a street environment that enable those important parts of a place to operate? When we think about movement, there are different types of movement. Unfortunately, we have entrenched behaviours and entrenched practices where we think about streets and roads from the lens of private motorists, and it's about getting to places quickly, getting through places. We don't often think about the role that streets play in terms of local access and local mobility. A really good example in those pictures is the positive influence that the Eastern distributor had on the local streets through Surrey Hills. It took traffic away from that environment, and positively it ended up in the great amenity along Crown Street and other streets through Surrey Hills, because we removed that function of through traffic, and it allowed us to enhance some of those elements of place and create more shade, create more vibrancy. In New South Wales and in many other jurisdictions around the world, we've looked to define or think about the several functions that a street plays in the context of movement and place. In the UK, it was Lincoln Place. But we thinking about how important the movement was, thinking about how important the place was, it allows us to easily define what that role a street plays, and the type of environment, the types of outcomes that we want to achieve through the design and operation of that street environment. What we've done here in New South Wales is we've established a set of what we call built environment indicators. A lot of them were largely influenced and informed by a lot of walkability analysis. What makes streets more walkable? How does that create better places? And how do we measure that? Historically, as I said, we've measured the performance of streets and how fast you can drive down the street, how much delay there is for a motorist travelling along the street. What we've tried to recognise here is the several elements of street functions and street environments, and measure them more holistically so that we can respond to the public needs and the role that a street plays in the public domain. And just the last slide, so these are a bit more detail on some of the built environment indicators. They're all captured within 5 key themes: access, connection, amenity use, green and blue, comfort and safety, character and form. And they cascade down into a series of built environment indicators that are all measurable. They've been mapped across Greater Sydney. We can quickly and easily see how well a street performs from the different road users or the different community needs. And through good planning, we can evaluate and measure and more appropriately respond to the different needs that streets play within the public domain. Thanks.
So I'll now welcome Crystal Legacy, who is Associate Professor of Urban Planning at the University of Melbourne and Co-Director of the Informal Urbanism Research Hub. She resides, writes and teaches on Wurundjeri country, where she publishes critical commentary on issues related to urban transport politics, public participation, and the post-political city in academic articles and local and national media. She also works in solidarity with a range of community-based groups seeking climate-just outcomes in transport planning. Thank you, Crystal.
Yeah, just switch the slide. If it's okay, I'm going to stand out here. If that's all right with everyone? Okay, great. The microphone's working. Okay, I don't want to stand between you and a great discussion, so I'll try to be as quick as I can. I'm seeing some really interesting threads, one of which is commodification of mobility and transport, and unfortunately I don't think I have good news to share on that front when we talk about participation, which is a bit of a left field sort of discussion point to bring into the discussion here on transport, but I think it's relevant. So I'm going to start with the provocation. What makes the planning of transport and the planning of mobility public? In my research, I explore the politics of infrastructure planning, namely big mega roads and light rail projects, and I consider their interactions with the politics of public participation. So this includes formal processes as sanctioned by government, as well as informal forms of participation, so community-led social movements, campaigns, organizing, resistance. And I've conducted this research mostly in Melbourne and Sydney, but also across Canadian cities in Vancouver and Toronto. And what I have come to see is that there's a place for publicness in the planning of transport and mobility in cities. In fact, publicness in planning is vital to ensuring our commitment to this thing called democratic planning. But this publicness is under threat. In my recent research with Associate Professor Janice Berry, Morgan Boyko from the University of Waterloo in Canada, as well as Dr. Matt Nowaczewski, we're showing that there's a publicness in planning, and we'd argue also the publicness in transport planning, which is supported and expanded through planning's embrace of community engagement, both informal and formal. However, our research is showing that there's a bifurcation, a separateness of participation away from planning. And this is connected to the rise of a public participation industry here in Australian cities. So what do I mean? Well, participation as a practice and the methodologies that support it are increasingly being delivered by a growing number of public participation practitioners. And these are professionals hired on contracts by government and development proponents to engage communities. And they're oftentimes consultants. And what our research is also illuminating is that there's a growing marketplace for public participation expertise, which may be expertise drawn from planning schools and planning education, like the one that I teach at, but also drawn from marketing and communications. It's a very different thing. You see, like so much of our planning, including the delivery of the management of mega roads and the franchising of public transport services, public participation is also privatizing. The planners working for state government authorities and local councils may have experience in community engagement, but they are not necessarily the people who are guiding communities in conversations about the places that matter to them. Instead, we are having public participatory processes that are being used to de-risk mega transport projects and to de-risk them from the threat of opposition and resistance to them. So community engagement is designed to manage expectations of the community that may, and as well as manage their involvement in these projects. So what we have is a public planning process that is disassociating from its own publicness. It's like when we disassociate from our own bodies. Cities are for people. It is the lifeblood, the life force of our cities. But we have designed processes that seek to curtail our full humanity in showing up in the ways that is necessary for us to talk about the hard things affecting us in cities today. So at the center of this disassociation is the way in which public engagement has become a feature that we can add to planning, rather than a virtue contained and fully embodied within planning. It is something that we contract out, subject to tender bids and commercialized approaches, rather than participation being a core feature, a core function of this very thing that we call planning. Likewise, there are those tendered out community engagement processes who are also being sought to generate a social license to build. So as my recent research with Associate Professor Dallas Rogers and Professor Chris Gibson we're seeing a reliance on public participation to secure the future of infrastructure, but may also have a perverse outcome for communities through this phenomenon called gaslighting, which I'm happy to talk more about in Q&A. So to make the point simply, participation is good for infrastructure and transport planning, but participation is not always good for communities. So you might be asking, so what? We have a growing population, a housing affordability crisis. We need infrastructure to accommodate our growth, and to build inclusive cities. Why is she going on about participation? Well, what's at stake is the rebuilding of trust in our public institutions like transport planning. This trust has eroded over decades, where the promise of better cities and places that are more fair and just has not borne out. So core virtue, and I'm going to wrap up here, a core virtue of participation, drawn from the early work of the late Patsy Healy, is all about how do we live better together. So how do we build social cohesion? How do we build societies that come together and thinking about the challenges that we face together? This is a core idea that's being discussed at the Commonwealth level, but it is disassociated from the planning process because what we're doing is commodifying and commercializing public participation. And that's a core concern. And in short, I think this is a big problem for transport planning because the publicness of transport planning is people coming together in an environment like this and having a conversation together. And who's leading it and who's fronting up in those moments of discussion need to be accountable. So the question of who's accountable for the publicness of transport planning is the one that I want to bring to the discussion today.
Thank you so much, Crystal. And I think now is the time that we're going to have all of the speakers sit up front and we'll get into a interesting discussion. And are we going to have David at the back looming over us? Fantastic. So while that's coming up, this was all amazing, and there were so many synergies across everyone's, different kind of angles coming at this question of publicness. But I'm just going to go to one of the questions that came from an audience member, and I think one that cuts across what everyone has spoken about, and I'll throw this out to everybody here, is do you see a tension between technical and political approaches to transport? And I think everyone here can have a different kind of take on that, maybe. Anyone want to start?
Yes.
Okay.
There's a big tension. We like to tell the story that transport's technical, but it's inherently political. And how we bring those two things together, everything from how we teach transport planning in geography, in engineering schools, all the way through to making sure people have agency in their work to engage within the political context upon which they practice. That's where they should come together, but unfortunately, they're not.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Anyone else?
Yeah, happy to. In the context of that discussion around engineering, street design, road design, I actually think that unfortunately the narrow technical view of things has influenced political decision making. We are what we measure. Mm-hmm. We too often measure, as I said, the performance and the function of street environments in the context of a single user, the motorist. And that's driven so many conversations, and we end up thinking that we create an evidence base, this technical approach to how we think about the design and operation of our road network, which ends up being so narrow that it cuts out all the other important public benefits that streets play within our public domain.
Emma?
I was going to say, an interesting thing about this campaign that we've been doing is like very specifically around people saying like, I would love to see more bus shelters. This would have big benefit on my community, for the health things like that. And then we take that to experts or government others and they say, actually, that's not what you want. What you want is a higher frequency of service. You want the bus routes to be different. That will make a much bigger difference. I'm like, I actually don't care about that at all. Like if you look at the most recent state budget, it's like, we would like this. This is what lots of people would like. And the transport investment for lots of different communities was more frequent bus services to the airport when it's opened. Like not locally, not to other transport hubs, not things like that, but to the airport when it's opened. And that's a frustration. And I don't know if that is a tension of political and technical, but For me, we're working with community members who say, like, this is the solution we have identified that we really want. And then to be told, actually, that's not the solution you want is extremely frustrating. Yeah.
It's certainly a disconnect between, like, actual publics and a conception of publics. David or Ian?
I can't see Ian, so I'll jump in. That's interesting because it's definitely been something that's a theme throughout my working life in buses, where you do have that. On one side, you've got planners talking about desire lines, etc. On the other side, you've got bus drivers who say this just doesn't work on the ground. And then in between those two, stopping them from having productive discussions is a whole bunch of people who don't really understand either point. I think one of the benefits of a public operator, for example, is that they would advocate, often within transport, sometimes against transport, they would advocate for those practical solutions and solutions that came from the travelling public. And so the solutions they were advocating were generally more informed from, a passenger perspective as opposed to sort of an abstract perspective or a politically informed one.
And Ian?
Look, I mean, I think it's a bit like Marshall McLuhan saying, the medium is the message. The technical side of it is the politics. The attempt to separate the two and say there's a tension between them as though they are different domains is the problem. I mean, they're not. You can't evacuate the politics out of it.
Fantastic. Okay, so there's a lot for us to chew on there. But I'd like to invite anybody from the audience who would like to ask a question, and we've got some roving mics, so just put your hand up if you. There's an enthusiastic hand.
If each of you had a magic wand and you got one wish, what would that be?
Just one wish.
Everyone's thinking deeply, but Emma, you look like you've.
Yeah, you'd think I'd say bus shelters, but I won't. The federal government at the moment is creating a thing called the National Climate Risk Assessment. It's like the biggest look at climate risks in this country, how we need to adapt. They've got lots of primary risks, bushfires, rising sea level, all the things like that. And one of the top 11 risks is failures of governance, where things fall in between jurisdictional cracks and then no one takes it up. And this is the federal government said this is a huge issue. And it's what I see when I look at our transport system, when we speak to the community members we work with. So a magic wand I would like to wave is for the people in charge to think of their roles outside the silos that they are, and that, we know that there are health implications to how the transport system is planned. I would like the people in charge of transport to understand that there are social and health and economic consequences for communities in how they plan, and that we need to look at the systems instead of in the silos of responsibility.
Wonderful. David, do you have one? I know that you can't see, so I'll just ask you directly.
I'm having issues with one.
Yeah.
I feel with the magic wand I should empower myself further, but look, I think I don't know how to sort of put it simply, but I think effectively I'd have to sit down, much like the clause in an industrial agreement, and make sure every word counted for my one wish, and would somehow remove the layers. I'd increase accountability between the people that use the service and deliver it and the people that purport to be in charge of it. Whether that would be transport or the government of the day, I don't know, but I think that's a fundamental gap, is there's no accountability.
Yeah, you can't see, but I'm nodding. I like that one very much.
Awesome.
Anybody else? Crystal?
I sit on a lot. I get invited to speak on industry panels a lot, and I talk a lot about participation in infrastructure planning. And it often comes up that this whole idea that communities are apathetic, that they just don't show up to be part of the conversation. And I think we got that wrong. I think they're showing up all the time. We're just not there. We're not meeting them where they are starting the conversation. And I think our relationship to public communication needs to be fundamentally reconceptualized, so that we see informal practices of participation as participation.
Fantastic. Neil, Ian?
Yeah, look, I'd probably, if I could have a magic wand, empower more people in our industry to be more creative and less risk averse. I think if we're going to bring the community and the public on the journey of cities like Sydney transforming and evolving rapidly, we need to be able to take a bit more risk, try things, show the people that there are better ways of doing things than building big roads for people to drive everywhere. And if we can show things in do things in more creative ways, we get public buy-in to delivering better outcomes.
Yeah, and I hear that from practitioners all the time. So it's clear that there is that real institutional interest among professionals to be less risk averse for sure. Ian?
Yeah, look, I think I'd like to see someone, well, a whole bunch of people with the skills to do some work, to put up a whole bunch of scenarios for the kind of public conversation that I think Kristen's advocating we have, or everyone's advocating we have, so that everybody in this room and everybody across Sydney and around Australia could actually have a sense of what the real challenge is to get us to net zero in terms of transport, and how many different ways are there we might get there. We don't have a bloody clue. And there is no planning going to. If there is planning, it's all being done behind closed doors. I want us to have a very public conversation about what it might really take to get us there, so that we can actually have a real conversation about it, because no one's talking about it.
Crystal?
I just wanted to add something else. I'm having two wishes now. We're in a room with practitioners and policymakers, presumably, and one of the things that I'd like to see more of is just be bold and be brave. We work increasingly in sectors that are casualized and a lot of precarity. And I think particularly with young, emerging planners, policymakers, engineers, there's a level of fear to kind of stick one's neck out to try to make the bold comment. And I think we need to kind of rally around each other so that we can engage with the politics, big P or small, in a way that is scary, but we build power in ways that we can take on governments and institutions that might be a bit rigid or whatever it might be, which is a very difficult thing to do. It's easy to say, but it is something that I wish we could do more of.
Do we have time for maybe one more? Any other questions? Go for it. Be brave. Be bold. One at the back there.
Hi, I'm Kumar. I'm a student here in Sydney. Hard university. I'm finding it very hard to. I just took a break this semester. So my question will be, publicness of transportation is like people who are walking is my focus. So the minimal that they get stopped when they are walking. Should be one of the focus. That means all this, the bridge we have got in Sydney University to cross the Parramatta Road is a beautiful example. Just we can. So similarly, wherever the minimization of people stopping, the time they wait and all, that could be one of the focus, I thought.
Fantastic, thank you. Maybe Ian or Neil are good to respond to that one.
The fact they're called big buttons,
Yeah.
I think you're talking about, you press this button and you have to wait for it to go through the full cycle. They don't have to be like that. They're actually buttons that are much more responsive. You could hit the button, and every time you hit it, within about 5 seconds or 10 seconds, the lights go green in your favour as a pedestrian. Now,
I have one where I live, actually. It's magical.
They're amazing.
One.
If we just simply, started rolling those out across the city, things would dramatically change in a very, very big way. It often is. It's like bus stops. I mean, some of the smallest parts of the system are where the biggest blockages are to actually doing something seriously different.
Neil, did you want to respond, or anybody else?
Yeah, all I'd say is, again, I think part of it comes back to what we have traditionally valued, and the high speed, segregation of space and uses within our street environment. It all has led to design outcomes and design solutions that is sold as safety measures and safety outcomes, but they're only creating these safety outcomes because of the original design decisions that we've chosen. If we had slower speed environments, a better acknowledged the need of and the space within street environments for all types of people, then some of those poor design outcomes probably wouldn't be seen as much.
Wonderful. I'm looking to our timekeeper. Oh, we have. Okay, all right. All right, that's very generous. Thank you. Okay, so does anyone else have any other questions that they'd like to? We've got a couple. Two at the front here.
Thank you. I'd just like to ask about why the use of the word publicness is here today, because I've never heard that word before, and I'm wondering what the situation is that there's a new need for that word here now and what we're trying to address by bringing it into play.
Great question. Crystal?
I'm happy to have a first go at it. I think we probably have different relationships with that word, but for me, I see it as a sort of an analytical term. It helps me to see private and public. It allows me to see power, who has it and who doesn't, who's struggling for power and who has it and is seeking to conceal it from others. So publicness is kind of us at the edge of that intersection and trying to reclaim some of the power that's been lost in transport and mobility. A lot of the words like commodification, client, customers, those words are very commodified and commercial words. And so publicness is, I think, trying to take that back somehow about power. Others might see it differently, though.
I'd say it in very similar terms. We've come such a long way that it's interesting that a question like that even gets asked. But it's a good question to ask. Why are we asking questions like that? When I first started out as an academic 20 years ago, students got given a reading. We were just talking about, I can't remember the exact author, but it was basically from a book that was talking about, the disappearance of the public realm. We are under threat. We're going to lose the public realm. And it was the sort of thing that academics would go, this is privatising public space. No one really seems to talk about that much anymore. I mean, there are whole cities, centre cities in the UK that are basically private domains because neoliberalism has completely taken over urban design and urban development. And it's a creeping, insidious thing when people don't realise this has happened to their cities and they no longer have genuinely public space. We've got one in the heart of Melbourne. Federation Square is actually a private space. The most famous public space in Melbourne is actually a private space.
I can also give a more boring answer as well, which is that it is a term that is used in a lot of scholarship to talk about what public means in a whole range of ways. And also if we used public transport in the title of this event, it would be very confusing because it's got another term. So I suppose this is a way of focusing on, public as a concept and trying to unpack it in a range of ways. Yeah. One more?
I guess just kind of about social cohesion and social isolation.
Yes.
How sort of our ideas of movement and transit affect those things, and what we can do to sort of improve, reduce social isolation.
You're doing great.
About reduce social isolation through the spaces and connection to community, I guess.
Such a great question.
Yeah,
Thank
and we
you
had
for
a lot
that.
of similar questions get submitted as well, so that's really great.
I've got something on that we've been thinking about as well. And it's more specifically about trees, but I think it applies to what we're talking about. Because we work on urban heat, we talk about trees a lot. I try not to talk about trees too much because then people start talking about their favourite tree and then we go down a little loop there. But the way trees are measured, like the greening of a city is measured, is mostly through satellites and through a really technocratic view of the city. We'll look at percentages of different areas, but we've got an aerial view of that. And when we do that, we look at sort of the cooling factors and, this neighbourhood compared to that neighbourhood and so on. But doing that abstracts actually the experience of being near trees. Like, we know that social cohesion and social connectedness is one of the most important things to keep people safe in heat waves. Like, we know that if you know your neighbours, if you see people on your streets, things like that, in any climate, in any disaster, this is how we know each other. And so there's this quite, like, you know, people say, well, we should have about 40% tree cover across the city, or in an area, and that has mental health benefits, it has, like, all sorts of cooling benefits. And we've been trying to think about having another sort of goal or a percentage about social green cover or, like, social greening. Because we're really big on having measurable targets that we can hold government to. And we've been talking to experts in other places and saying, like, what would it look like to have a target for green spaces and trees that increase social cohesion? And what, like, type of space would that be? Would it be community gardens and parks? Would it be, you know, trees on certain routes where we know people will walk? But I'd love to, I guess, deepen that idea and start promoting it as an essential, like to go beyond the idea that we need X amount tree cover that we measure by satellite, but to go towards, like, oh, we need this type of city that helps us be this sort of people and this type of society. So I think it's a great question.
Kristen?
I might just say very quickly, I've been thinking a lot about social cohesion and specifically around participation, which often gets framed as like community versus government, right? It's this polarity, and it's far more complex than that, of course. You know, we live in a pluralistic society. And social cohesion is really interesting in respect to thinking about infrastructure planning, especially transport projects that usually extend across many geographies in a city. Like West Connects would be a great example here. And what we see with participation and thinking it through using a lens of gaslighting, structural gaslighting, which is a body of work I'm working up at the moment with colleagues, is how governments, through participatory practices, can divide and conquer communities, pit them against each other, situating certain offerings to communities who then feel they've got what they needed to feel okay with the offering of the big project, and you're unable to build that solidarity. And participation is really interesting in how it's being used because it's instrumentalizing the person who's showing up at a community meeting or whatever and getting them to do the one thing, the count. I can count you, you're here, I count you, you're one of 10,000, without actually having a deep engagement around what's at stake for all of us. So I think social cohesion is really important. I think we need to start thinking and reconceptualizing participation, which is my general point for today.
All right. So unfortunately, we've got to leave it there. But like, there's so much here to feed so many other, conversations that we hope we keep having as a community as well. But I'll just say thank you so much to all of the panelists who spoke here today. Thank you so much to all of the audience that we've had here today and for showing up and asking great questions. And thank you so much to the organisers of the event and the crew for, putting all of this together and allowing this discussion to happen. And I'll also remind you, as Greta did at the beginning, that from maybe in 20 minutes, there's going to be another event in this exact room. So if you'd like to see the comedy event, you can just stay here, eat some food, and smoothly go into the next session. But yeah, thank you very much.